I use the word superhuman in this case. I really mean it. You see them underwater and it's like, nothing I've ever seen before. We're starting to see that epigenetic changes can actually be passed on from parent to offspring. What you believe about your genes can actually change your physiology.
This episode is sponsored by SciSummary. As the name suggests, SciSummary is a summarizing tool for research papers and actually any PDF you provide. However, SciSummary is more than just a summarizing tool. It effectively lets you chat with your papers. You can ask questions like what materials and methods are being used, but it can also provide you with insights into potential avenues for future research based on the papers you provide. SciSummary is constantly evolving, and you can now also request small podcast episodes of the papers you put in, giving you a nice audio experience of your papers. As a listener of Apple Finch Pudding, I can give you 1 month of SciSummary for free. All you have to do is click on the link in the description below or type in scisummary.com/AFP1 and use the coupon code AFP1 at checkout. AFP stands for Apple Finch Pudding, 1 because you get 1 month of SciSummary for free. Go check it out, see if it's something you like. If you do, please go for it. If you don't, no hard feelings. But for now, let's get back to the show. Welcome to Apple Finch Pudding, your gateway into the world of science. Today's scientist is Melissa Ilardo, a professor of Biomedical Informatics at the University of Utah. Her work focuses on human evolution. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Before we start, do you have a fun science fact for our listeners?
So I have a fact that's kind of science adjacent. So I think it's really fun it's interesting that Charles Darwin had really severe seasickness. So the whole time he was on the Beagle traveling around the Galapagos Islands, he was suffering from severe seasickness. And because of this, he really took advantage of any opportunity he had to be on land. And so a lot of, his discoveries around evolution that came from the Galapagos, maybe in part because he was just really trying to get off the boat.
I actually didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. As someone who suffers from seasickness myself, I sympathize.
Yeah. Well, it must have been horrible because he was on sea for a long time.
I know. I can't even imagine.
Now, Melissa, your work focuses on human evolution. You've dedicated years to it. Why are you drawn to human evolution? Was there like some tipping point when you got attracted to that topic or something?
So actually, connected to my fun fact, part of what inspired my love of evolution was a trip to the Galapagos when I was in high school. So at the time, I was really obsessed with physics. I was determined to be an astrophysicist. And I thought that, as Ernest Rutherford has said, all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And then I took this trip to the Galapagos, and it was so magical. And, learning about how evolution can and has shaped everything in the natural environment just really inspired me to see it as kind of math in biology. And so I think my love of evolution was born out of the Galapagos.
It's actually also linked to the name of the podcast, as Finch refers to Darwin's finches.
Great. Yeah, I love it.
Oh, and did you see some of the finches, or was there something else that really caught your eye there?
Yeah, we saw the finches, we saw just really the incredible plant life and how it has diversified, this island biogeography that happened, with all these species making it to this tiny set of islands in the middle of nowhere. I remember seeing the penguins there and just thinking about how all these different species have kind of evolved to fill these different niches that the islands present. It was just really fascinating to me.
I can imagine that must be mind-blowing. But now your work focuses on human evolution. Over time, what are like some of the major steps we encountered in human evolution, and what is human evolution doing right now?
Yeah, so my interest in human evolution is really more in the recent parts of human evolution, though I obviously think, evolution of our species is fascinating. I'm just really curious about, we started from Africa a very short time ago. And in that time, since we spread out of that continent, we've inhabited an incredible diversity of environments. Kind of like these finches, these animals that made it to the Galapagos, were really filling all of these different niches. And so I'm really curious about the ways that humans have evolved quite rapidly to live in such an incredible diversity of environments.
Before we delve into that, I have one side question that's linked to this. In the sense, we have strange environments right now. Are there evolutionary things that are happening that are bad for us? For example, are we weakening as a species because we are living luxuriously or because of environmental pollution like plastics or stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how, some of these environmental factors that are affecting us, like microplastics, like PFAS, like the changes in climate, how that may influence our species in the coming generations. I don't know if we have enough time to evolve to deal with some of these things, just because even, when we talk about evolution happening quickly, it's still often thousands of years. And so these changes are happening at a rate that's totally unprecedented. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Then going to the longer scale, the human evolution that you're looking at. So you actually look at superhumans, you call them. And I actually have a paper of you that references this nicely. So it's called Human Adaptation to Extreme Environmental Conditions. And you mentioned three types of adaptations, both to the living in the Arctic, to high altitude, and to deep diving. What are some of your insights based on that paper and your work since then?
I think most of the work that I've had the pleasure of doing has been with divers. There have been incredible researchers working in other areas of human adaptation, but my focus so far has been on these super divers. It's really interesting to see this arise as a cultural phenomenon, people who are living near the marine environment and just see the resources that are available there and decide to take advantage of that through diving. So they're holding their breath and they're diving. And that's something as mammals, we're evolved to do. There was at some point in our past, all mammals had a common ancestor that developed something called the mammalian dive reflex. But more recently, these populations who are living so closely intertwined with the sea have really gone even a step further. So they've really kind of perfected that reflex to make them even better divers. So, we're finding that multiple populations who are exhibiting this behavior where they're diving, for everything that they need, have actually evolved to be better at that. And it's really exciting because I think prior to the work that I did in Indonesia with the divers there, it wasn't really known if this was a strong enough selective pressure to actually change our genome, change our physiology. And now we're seeing, it seems like, yes, it is. And it seems like, people are changing in many different ways around the world because of this behavior.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, you have seen changes in stuff like the size of the spleen. Can you give us a bit more on what is happening right there?
That's right. Yeah. So part of the mammalian dive reflex, kind of one of the weirder parts of the reflex is that your spleen contracts. And so the spleen is an organ we don't really think about very much. You can live without one. So, it's kind of a strange thing. But what it does, one of the functions of the spleen is to store oxygenated red blood cells. So these red blood cells are there, kind of as a reserve. So they're ready when you need them. The spleen contracts, they get pushed into circulation, and you get this oxygen boost. And so this actually happens to a lesser extent during strenuous activity. So if you're running, your spleen is also contracting a little bit to, again, give you this oxygen boost. But it really happens most strongly during diving. So when you dive, when you hold your breath and you're submerged in water, your spleen contracts, and it gives you about a 10% increase in the available oxygen through the circulation of these red blood cells. What we found in the Bajau, these are the indigenous divers of Indonesia, and actually Bajau, in some places they call them Bajau, in some places they say Orang Laut, but it's all part of this continuous population of sea nomads inhabiting the waters of Southeast Asia. And so what we found was that they have spleens that are about 50% larger than the neighboring populations who haven't historically interacted with the sea. And so we think that that extra spleen capacity is giving them extra oxygen for these long dives that they do.
There are really big differences, like 10% in your red blood cells and 50% in size in spleen. That must have a big effect on how those people are functioning in those circumstances.
Yeah, we haven't tested it directly, but we're really interested to see how exactly this is increasing their capacity. And just kind of anecdotally, having gone diving with them, I mean, they really, I use the word superhuman in this case. I really mean it. You see them underwater and it's like, nothing I've ever seen before. They're just so comfortable holding their breath. And, we think this is at least a part of what's contributing to that ability.
And I assume everyone asks this, but when you say they dive without air, how long do they stay underwater?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and unfortunately, one that we don't have a great answer to, because it really depends on what they're diving for. I mean, if they're diving shallow to collect a lot of, shellfish, then they're coming up to the surface a lot to drop those off in their boat. If they're diving deeper to spear fish, they're down there for longer because they're trying to get multiple fish before they come back up. So we really don't have good data on how long they hold their breath. But I mean, just again, watching them, you can see it's multiple minutes and it's very active. So when we think of static breath holds, a lot of the records we hear about are people just floating in a pool. And so that's a very different physiology than someone who's diving and is super active underwater. I mean, they look like hunters. They're like stalking their prey underwater. And it's this really, you would think, oxygen intensive activity. So it's not just the length of their dives that's impressive, but it's what they're doing while they're underwater.
If I'm not mistaken, you study this in two different spots, so Indonesia and I think Korea. Did you see similarities or dissimilarities between those two groups?
That's right. So in Korea, so I've recently been working in Korea, and it's interesting because in Korea, all of the divers are women. So men don't dive. And so that, has interesting effects both on the natural selective pressures in that population, but also kind of some of the physiology that we're seeing. So what we saw in Korea, in Indonesia, we only measured spleen size. And that's because, I was a PhD student with a crazy idea, kind of on my own, trying to figure this out. And so I didn't, I was trying to think of what was the least invasive measurement that we could do, but that also might, give us some kind of insight into their diving ability. So in Korea, fortunately, I was later in my career and had a much more, better, more built out team of physiologists helping me. And so we were able to measure not only spleen size, we also measured hematology, so blood kind of features. We measured, we did something called simulated dives. So we actually had them dive in a controlled laboratory environment. So I mentioned before, if you hold your breath and submerge yourself in water, you have this reaction. You can actually trigger that same reaction just by putting your face in a bowl full of cold water. So through these simulated dives, we're able to safely measure components of the dive reflex in a laboratory setting. So we measured during these simulated dives, we measured heart rate and blood pressure. And so, we saw some really interesting changes in terms of their blood pressure response to diving in Korea. Whether that's true in Indonesia as well, we don't really know because we haven't measured it yet, but we're now really curious to go back and measure that there. But yeah, what we saw in Korea, we think is that they have actually evolved a mechanism to protect them from the dangers of diving during pregnancy. So again, this is really influenced by the fact that Korean divers are all women.
Can you tell us a bit more, like how do you mean they are protected against diving when they're pregnant?
Yeah, absolutely. So they dive pretty much until the day they give birth. And another component of the dive reflex, which I mentioned before, so your spleen contracts, but you also have this increase in blood pressure. And that's because your blood vessels in the periphery of your body, so the parts of your body that don't need the oxygen quite as much, constrict. And because of that constriction, there's less space for the blood. And so your blood pressure increases. So in the moment, this is very helpful. But if you're pregnant, it increases your risk of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, they're called. So these like blood pressure related disorders that can be fatal to both mother and child. And so what they've evolved is a genetic variant that makes it so that when they dive, and we know this from our simulated dives, their blood pressure doesn't increase as much. So we think in that way, they're actually protected against the risk of diving during pregnancy.
And you said in Korea it were mostly or purely women or female divers. Why is that?
I've heard a lot of answers to that question. It's a good question. Some people say it's because of a tax on men's work at a certain point in the recent past. So because men were taxed at such a higher rate, they, started having women do the profitable work of diving. Some people, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that are put out there. I wonder if there is, some kind of physiological advantage that women have in cold water specifically over men that we're still, coming to understand. And I wonder this because there are a lot of cold water diving populations where it's mostly or exclusively women who dive. So it's a small sample size, let's see. But I think it's interesting that, again and again, we're seeing it pop up in these cultures where it's mostly women diving.
And are those women then revered because of their ability to dive and collect food?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I would say they're certainly respected, but then there's also certain, at least I heard from some of the Haenyeo in Korea, now they're very much revered. There's statues all over the island. Everything is celebrating the Haenyeo. There's a Haenyeo museum that's fabulous. But even, 30, 40 years ago, these women were diving in cotton bodysuits, or, in Japan, 70 years ago, they were diving naked. And so they were kind of considered a little bit scandalous in a way that I think they were, they tend to be very tan, whereas a lot of women are trying to have lighter skin. They tend to be very loud because they're exposed to cold water in their ears all the time. And whereas, a lot of the other women are trying to speak very softly and be very delicate. So I think there was kind of up until recently, some women told me that they were somewhat embarrassed to be Haenyeo, but I think more recently there's been this shift to really admiration and respect that they deserve.
Yeah, I completely agree. They deserve that respect because what they do is amazing.
It's incredible.
And maybe also you work with these people, but are they willing to work with scientists? Because I mean, I can imagine that they don't see the added benefit of it.
Yeah, so that's a really fun part of the work is having the conversation with them about how can this benefit you? What do you want to know? Is there anything that you see, that we could possibly help with that would add value? And we try to design the study, around that. So recently I've been talking to a different population who's curious to find out whether they're related to the Haenyeo, how they might be related to the Haenyeo. And that's something, that's a question we can answer with DNA. So it's really exciting when we have these, synergies where they have questions that we can answer. So we always try to make sure that, the research and the process is benefiting the community in some way. And I really love having those conversations. So far, every community that I've worked with has been really interested and curious about the research. I haven't really met any resistance, but I always go into the conversation completely open-minded. If they say, you know what, we don't want this, then we say, okay, you know where we are. If you want it in the future, let us know. Because it's really up to the community whether or not they want to participate. And that's really important to us.
I love the way how you tackle this and how open you are to their input and also to their ability to just reject it without pushing them. I think that's really nice of you because sometimes people are just so curious that they tend to push, which is, I understand it, but it's not always that great.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. It's really important. I mean, it's something that I value kind of at my core. It's just making sure that it truly is a partnership and not just extraction of science from a community.
And what are some of the questions that you're trying to tackle with your research?
So now we're really curious, kind of following up on the results that we found with the Haenyeo, especially. It seems that the genetic variant that's affecting their blood pressure may have to do with the blood vessels themselves. And we're wondering whether this may also contribute to protection against other diseases. So the island of Jeju, which is where these divers live, has a very low rate of stroke mortality. So they have actually around the island, they have kind of high levels of blood pressure generally, but very low stroke mortality. And usually these things correlate quite strongly. So we're wondering if, protection against diving during pregnancy also has this added benefit where people are less likely to die of a stroke because of the same effects that it's having on their blood vessels. So we're really curious about these kind of translational aspects of the project. So how can we, take this understanding of this superhuman population and use it to benefit not only that community, but also people around the world?
Based on those adaptations, do those people also have the potential to be, for example, great athletes on land?
Yeah, we wonder about that as well, because, as I mentioned, the spleen not only contracts during diving, but also during running. So, I mean, there's a great example of could this somehow benefit people, in other athletic or performance enhancing settings? Of course, they don't want to get in trouble with WADA for that, the World Anti-Doping Agency, but
Yeah.
it would be interesting. I mean, not just for health, but also for performance, to see how some of these things translate.
Maybe it's also important for the listener to make some distinctions, like we've talked about evolution, but you have genetics, epigenetics, and physiological adaptation. Can you give us some insights on the difference between those three?
Exactly. Yeah. Those are, it's really important to keep those separate. So, genetics is you have these changes that happen. It's, maybe in an ancestor 100 generations ago had a genetic variant that was beneficial, and they've passed that along to you. So this is a change that you were born with that you will pass on to your children. It's deeply coded into who you are. Then we have epigenetics, which we're really just kind of starting to understand, which is changes. It's kind of like molecules added onto DNA due to environment or other factors that change the way genes are expressed. And so this just means, your genes are like an instruction manual, and then how quickly you're reading that is kind of gene expression. And so you could read it really slowly and produce very little of something, or really fast and produce a lot. So that gene expression, those kinds of changes are caused by epigenetics. And then we have physiological adaptation, like you mentioned. And so this is training. So, if I off the couch with no training at all, go try to hold my breath, I'm not going to be able to hold it for very long. But if I go train that, there's schools where you can go and learn these techniques to train that behavior. And, as you're doing it, you're expanding your lungs, you're changing these things about your body that we call plastic, so changeable. Then that's a physiological adaptation. And we actually saw an interesting example of that in the Haenyeo as well. So the Haenyeo have this training adaptation, and we could distinguish this because we tested essentially Haenyeo divers and Haenyeo non-divers. So people who have the same genetic background, the only difference is whether or not they're diving. And so what we saw was that the divers, when they held their breath, the kind of third component of the mammalian dive reflex is that your heart rate drops. And so, fewer beats, you're using your oxygen more slowly. So you're not going through it every heartbeat less. You're using less of that valuable oxygen as you're holding your breath. And so what we saw in the Haenyeo is that from this lifetime of training, their heart rate drops extraordinarily quickly. So it actually drops 50% faster than untrained people with the same genetic background. And so this is a training effect that has actually been observed in other trained competitive freedivers. So there's something about the training of freediving that causes your heart to learn, okay, now I'm diving, I need to slow down even more.
But epigenetics and physiological adaptations are not hereditary, right?
Uh, hmm. Physiological adaptations are not. Epigenetics, we're still kind of trying to figure out. It kind of goes into this. Lamarck was this person who said that giraffes had long necks because they're reaching for plants. So this idea that you can pass down traits that kind of you've picked up in your lifetime, which is very against Darwinian evolution. So epigenetics is almost Lamarckian. So we're starting to see in certain examples where when you have these epigenetic changes, sometimes those are passed down. And we don't really understand exactly how that works, but we've seen it in cases of, I think there was a study done with mice where they essentially, these poor mice, they traumatized them to, get an electric shock when they heard a certain sound. And then they took their offspring away from them and raised them entirely separately. And those offspring responded similarly. And they think it's through epigenetic change. I hope I'm not getting that study wrong. But, we're starting to see that epigenetic changes can actually be passed on from parent to offspring. So again, it's not a change that's, hard coded in your DNA. It's these molecules that are added on, but it does seem like there's some sort of mechanism for passing those changes on potentially.
I think I've heard that it's also linked sometimes to trauma, that trauma can
Yes.
be passed through, but epigenetically. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So there is some ongoing work with refugees, especially from war-torn countries, showing that some of these genetic changes caused by trauma can be passed on. Hopefully, work will show also that, positive changes can be passed on. I'm not sure if that's been focused on yet. But yeah, it's really interesting to think, we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, and here's a way of actually quantifying that. It's actually a change that's biologically passed on.
And what is actually passed on in those cases?
It would be the modification, and this is, a bit outside of my our area of expertise, but the modification of the DNA. So it changes how certain genes are expressed. And this makes sense because, imagine if you're in a low resource environment, in the long ago past, you're starving, you need your offspring to also kind of adjust metabolically if they're going to survive. And so if you can change the expression of your genes to reduce the effect of that starvation, then that's of course an effect you want to pass on to your offspring. So yeah, it's these kind of molecules attached to the DNA that change their expression.
And these epigenetic changes and also the physiological adaptations, can they induce genetic changes or not really?
Not that I know of. But so I think, and that's why evolution takes so long, because you need a mutation or just kind of a variant that's out there by chance to appear in a population and add benefit. And so mutation doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, it's mostly bad. That's why we don't even actually see most mutations because they often make an embryo non-viable. So most mutations just get wiped out immediately. So the chance of getting this beneficial mutation that happens to work well in a particular environment is just so small. That's what makes it take so long for us to evolve these new traits.
We talked about genetics, epigenetics, physiological adaptations. In the past, there was a strong belief in genetic determinism. That is not completely true. Can you explain what the limits are of genetic determinism?
Genetic determinism, yeah, is a really interesting and we're starting to see flawed concept. And it's this idea that your genes determine who you are. It's kind of the classic nature versus nurture. And so, it's a really dangerous concept because we're starting to find out, kind of like with the placebo effect, what you believe about your genes can actually change your physiology. This is really harmful, especially when certain communities are only studied because of the diseases that are present in those communities. So, they start to have this kind of internalization of the idea that their population is going to get sick. Their population is going to have type 2 diabetes, their population, all of these things. And it starts to lead to this belief that, it's inevitable. And we know that that's not true. There's so many things that you can do to affect your health status, your well-being, that are outside of your genes. Of course, there are certain things, if your genes say that you're going to have brown eyes, you're going to have brown eyes. You can't, unless you're going to manipulate something, that's not going to change. But I think that it's really important to keep in mind that these things that increase our likelihood of developing a certain disease or of being a certain way are not written in stone. There's a lot that we can do, even just through the power of, believing in our ability to be well, that can overwrite those genetics. That said, there are certain genetic factors that it's important, I think, to keep in mind. So things like the BRCA genes that really drastically increase your chance of developing breast cancer. That's an important one to be aware of because there are preventative measures that you can take based on your genetic likelihood of developing that cancer. But when it comes to things like, one that's often included in studies, and it really bothers me, is educational attainment. So people look at something called polygenic risk scores. So basically how your combination of genetic variants adds up to to determine your level of educational attainment. And really, at least in the US, what this has historically been is how European is your ancestry. And that's not because of, European ancestry means you're more likely to have higher educational attainment, from a biological perspective. It's totally because of social factors, environmental factors. So it's a really dangerous idea when we start saying, oh yeah, like your genes say you're going to have low educational attainment. Dangerous, one, because you might believe that about yourself, and two, because society might believe that about you based on, genetic evidence.
Yeah, that is very dangerous. So if I understand correctly, they are actually based on your genes determining how smart you are or how smart you can be. Is that what they try to do?
There have been some studies in the past, yeah, that essentially they're essentially identifying correlations between genes and and educational attainment. So how far you go in your education, which, yeah, like I said, like that's exactly the kind of science that played into race-based medicine in the past, and that really just kind of amplifies some of stereotypes that are still affecting how people are treated in medical settings today.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to emphasize what you said, that we have a lot of flexibility. Of course, some things are fixed in our DNA, but there's a lot of wiggle room. I mean, last year there was a paper that came out that actually said that the shape of your face changes based on the name that you're given.
Really? Wow, I haven't seen that. That's very interesting.
The name of the paper, I have written it down. Can names shape facial appearance? And they used AI to check. And what they did was they had babies, and it was impossible to predict the name based on their face. And for adults, they were able to predict the names based on their face. So the faces were actually adapting based on their names.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, if even that is happening, a lot is possible.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There's a very interesting documentary film that I always recommend in terms of this nature versus nurture. And it's called Three Identical Strangers. And it's about, I mean, I won't give it away, but essentially it goes a lot into how genes and environment can interplay, and also it goes into some very unethical science. So I'll leave it at
Okay.
that.
I'm both intrigued and a bit scared.
Yeah. As you should be, I think.
Okay. And in that same context, there are also now companies that are actually trying to determine what sports you should do based on your DNA. I mean, that's also very limiting and even not taking into account what you love to do.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good example, of where this can be misinterpreted, and where, yeah, like you said, I mean, what you love to do has such a stronger influence on what you're good at than than what your genes say. I mean, there are genes that have been correlated with different distribution of muscle fiber types and things like that. But even then, it's rarely so clear that you have one genetic change that you can say, oh, this person definitely should be a sprinter. This person definitely should do endurance sports. So it's I not to, belittle those companies, but it's not something that I would pay for.
Well, and I don't know if you know her. It's a famous Belgian gymnast, Nina de Waal. And she did or started gymnastics when she was very young. And I think when she was about 12, they told her you're actually too tall to do gymnastics. So I think if they would have checked her DNA when she was young, they would have said, don't do gymnastics, you will be too tall. But now
Uh-huh.
she's like a gold medalist for the Olympics, for World Games. She's winning all those gold medals. And if they would have checked her DNA, they would have said, don't do gymnastics. So
Right,
that's
right, yeah.
insane.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot we can learn from genetics, but we should definitely take it all with a grain of salt.
I've also heard that some of the things that we unconsciously try to drive maybe genetics based, for example, on the partners we choose. And the idea was, for example, if you have a big nose and you don't like your nose, you're more likely to be attracted to someone with a small nose because genetically that evens out.
There was an interesting study on this regarding our ability to smell people's immune systems. And in that way, we're attracted to people who have very different immune systems from our own, which makes sense. If you want to give your offspring the best chance at survival, of course, you want to give them the most diverse set of immune genes so they can respond to, pathogens well. But yeah, it's interesting. Even the nose thing, though, I do wonder to what extent that could be more, culturally, socially driven than genetically driven. But all of these things are so interlinked. It's really hard to know what's driving us.
Yeah, and your research, how do you try to disentangle all those factors? Because I mean, that must be really difficult.
Yeah, it is. And, we take a very narrow and in this way kind of naive approach, a focus on just purely the changes in the genome that we can measure. And so we're just looking nucleotide by nucleotide, so base, pair by base pair in the genome, at these changes that are just purely hard coded. Of course, when we're looking at phenotypes, these physiological traits, we want to separate out things that could be training adaptations, like I mentioned. So that's why we always look at people who have been doing the activity, diving mostly, and people who have the same genetic background but don't do that activity, because that's really important. If it's something that's likely to be driven by genetics, we'll see the same thing across both of those groups. If it's something that's likely driven by training, we'll only see it in the people who have been training. So yeah, we do our best to disentangle all of these features, but it's a very complicated puzzle, and we're just looking at this small part of it.
Yeah, because I think in that case, you can also have that for both people with and without training have the genetic adaptation, but it's not expressed in one of those groups.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's this really interesting field called gene by environment interaction. So these interactions between environment and genes, and between, environment includes, activities. So maybe even, this heart rate training effect that we've observed, maybe it's actually that they're more trainable. So maybe there is a genetic component to that, that we haven't identified yet, where yeah, there's a training effect, but it's amplified by some underlying genetic change. So, again, there's so many layers to this that you could spend a lifetime just focusing on one of these populations.
Yeah, I can imagine. And also in our current culture, then I think mostly more in the Western world as well, has been a lot of changes, example in medicine. For example, you mentioned the BRCA genes. If you have those genes and you want to have children, now you can select embryos that don't have the BRCA gene, so you don't pass that on to your children. I mean, you can easily shift to something that is less ethical as well. And for example, you can go light from I want to select the right eye color to maybe trying to have smarter children. How do you see that evolving? Do you think we are going in a bad way, or do you think we are neutral right now, or do you see some problems with that?
Yeah, it's a really complicated, question, a really complicated set of ethical considerations, because, I always think it comes down to this line between what is correcting, a deficiency or an issue versus what's enhancing. And that's just something that's so subjective. So I think about it sometimes in terms of, as men age, their testosterone drops. And so now you can go to a doctor as an older man and have your testosterone measured. It's lower than, the normal range. And so you get testosterone. But is that the normal range for your age? Like, what is normal? And so there's this idea that maybe older men who are getting testosterone, it's actually enhancing. It's not correcting, because there's nothing wrong with them. They're aging normally. But to them, it feels like correcting. And so, when you think about the kind of parallel idea, like you're mentioning with these embryos, what is a correction? What is enhancing? Where do we draw those lines? And it's so subjective that I don't know how we're going to figure all this out in the future. But, BRCA is a great example, because that's, of course, if you could avoid passing that on to your children, you would want to do that. But then that obvious, of course I should do that, is so different for every person.
It's also like you said, it's correcting a deficiency, but a deficiency is not the same for everyone. For
Exactly.
example, I can imagine that some people, when they know that their children could have autism, they would prefer not to have that. But actually, people with autism, some people can function normally, and it can even be an advantage. For example, I can imagine in STEM environment, it can be an advantage to have some degree of autism. So
Absolutely.
where do you draw that line? And yeah,
Right, right. Yeah, it's so interesting. So in university, one of the we had a lecture from a neuroscientist before university even started. It was like an introduction to university, and he surveyed the incoming students, and he said, how many of you have a family member with autism? And he put up the percentage, and then he said, okay, how many of the incoming engineering students have a family member with autism? And it was like twice as high. So that gets to exactly what you're saying, where, in certain fields, it's actually a huge advantage to have some, to be somewhere on the spectrum. It's, focus. It's, it can be a huge advantage, I should say. So yeah, like, do you correct that? Is that a deficiency? It's certainly not, for some people, that's a superpower. And certainly people on the spectrum wouldn't feel like they are a deficiency that needs to be corrected. It's the same with hearing impairment or vision impairment or, people. I remember reading a book about happiness once, and it said people who, I forget if it was people who had lost a limb or who had become paralyzed to some extent, they measured happiness, before and after. I can't remember exactly how the study was conducted, but essentially people were no less happy after, despite the fact that they had predicted that they might be, after losing a limb or whatever it was. And so it's just like, again, we have, how can we, when we're so bad at predicting our own happiness, how can we predict the happiness of the child that hasn't even been born yet and make decisions for them on that account?
yeah, no, I totally agree. I just want to point out for the listeners, and you're not saying that, but just to be clear that people, for example, with autism can really suffer depending on the degree of autism
Of
and where you're
course.
on the spectrum. And there are people with real problems, but it's not always that bad. That's what we're
Yes,
saying.
of course, of
I just
course.
don't want to offend anyone.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate you clarifying that. Yeah.
And in the same line of thought, actually, a few years ago in China, there was this idea, or actually, there have been babies born that were CRISPRed. It was something to do, I think, it was with a disease, right? Was it with HIV, I think, that they tried to avoid?
That sounds right. I can't remember exactly, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's also, again, the line that's even not selecting an embryo anymore, that's actually changing the embryo. Do you think there is potential benefits in that, or do you think that's, yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't want to answer ethical questions, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm just afraid that I'm not going to give a very fun answer because my answer is mostly just I don't know. Because yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because, again, an example of that could be sickle cell anemia is caused by single base pair change. That's something that theoretically would be quite easy to correct with some of these technologies that are emerging. So, again, is that something that should be done? I don't know. I think in a way, fortunately, I should say, air quotes. You can't hear my air quotes, but I think we're not quite there yet with the technology. Like it's not quite good enough to do that in a way that's reliable and safe consistently. So I think we don't have to ask that question just yet. I mean, I know they're doing it in rare cases, but I think to do it more broadly, we're not quite there. But yeah, it won't be long until we are. And at that point, what's the answer? I have no idea.
Yeah, and also it's really hard if you even make a small adaptation to have the whole picture of what is happening. Because I'm not completely sure, but I think, for example, if you said to adapt sickle cell anemia, if I'm not mistaken, that actually protects the people against malaria.
That's right.
So then they're more inclined to get malaria. That's also not what you want.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So if you have one copy of the variant, you're protected against malaria. If you have two copies, you have sickle cell anemia. But yeah, it's everything is complicated. Of course there are, and we don't really we have no idea what's going to happen if you make those changes and what are the downstream effects of that. That's still very much something that we're figuring out. And yeah, even when we do, I have no idea how we'll untangle the ethics of that.
And based on all your work and research, what are some of the most profound things that you've discovered or learned about humans?
People do incredible things. And I've just seen that over and over, visiting these populations. It's really inspiring. And I think that, scientifically and kind of culturally, the most important thing to me is respecting the incredible things that these people do, respecting that through, our admiration of what they do, but also through giving them kind of the scientific respect that they deserve by looking into some of these questions with them. And so, understanding their adaptations, I think, is a way of acknowledging how incredible their activities are, how incredible these divers are. They're deserving of our attention and admiration.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there are so many amazing people out there, but that also begs the question I think you might be well equipped to answer. What do you think we are missing? What are the questions that we should be asking based on that field on human evolution and that maybe not a lot of people are asking?
I think we've really underestimated up to this point how quickly humans can evolve to some of these activities and environments. And so I think, looking at more of these incredible populations and asking, we can clearly see there's something special about them. What is that, and does that have a biological basis? And I think that's something that a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people be somewhat dismissive about, oh no, they're just trained. If you take them out of that environment, it goes away. There's nothing biologically special about that population. And to me, it's great for me that people have felt that way because it leaves a lot of questions out there to be answered. But I think that that's something that we should be asking more.
And if you say it surprised you how fast human evolution is, what is fast in these terms?
Yeah, so it's a relative term. Fast for us is in the Haenyeo, we saw the change in this genetic variant happening over the last 1,200 years. So on an evolutionary scale, that's extremely fast, at least for humans. So we see, like in Darwin's finches, actually going back to the Galapagos, Peter and Rosemary Grant were a couple who did incredible work in the Galapagos. And over a period of 40 years, they were actually able to show a change in beak shape because of environmental changes that the island experienced. So that's, extremely rapid evolution. And we haven't seen anything like that in humans, and I think human culture contributes a lot to that. We're just buffered against a lot of these factors by the fact that we're a collective culture or population or species. But yeah, so in humans, 1,200 years is extremely fast for evolution.
Did they understand correctly for this finch? Was it in 40 years?
It was something like that. I need to go back to the study itself, but it was so fast that they actually measured it over many, many years of going out to the field and counting every finch on this one island and measuring every beak. And, they knew these finches essentially by name. So their work just showed how quickly, especially when you have a population where, a drought that changes seed shape can rapidly affect a huge portion of the population of these birds. When you have a case like that, evolution can happen very, very quickly.
Maybe to be devil's advocate, do we know that it's evolution or is it an adaptation, like physiological adaptation or something?
I think because beak shape is genetically determined, as far as I understand, again, this is not my area, I think there was a compelling argument for it being genetic evolution. I'm not sure if there's been work since to actually computationally show those changes happening, but I'd have to go back to the paper.
If I understood you correctly throughout this conversation, human evolution is too slow to adapt to things like climate change and stuff like that. But assume we do have enough time. So climate change is occurring, but it's going a lot slower, for example. What are the limits for human evolution? Like, I mean, we're not going to be X-Men, we're not going to have laser eyes, but what is possible? Do you have an idea of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think especially in the context of climate change, because, one of the things about climate change is that it's creating so much variability in the climate that also makes it very hard for us to evolve in any way to fit that pressure. Because, if climate change were exclusively creating droughts, we could absolutely evolve in ways where we need less water. We can survive, being what we would now consider dehydrated all the time. There are populations who live in these extremely dry climates. We could evolve for that. But climate change isn't just drought. Sometimes it's, incredible amounts of rain and flooding. And so it's that variability, that inconsistent selective pressure. It's hard to imagine us being able to evolve to that variable of a climate. But yeah, in terms of what evolution would be capable of producing in humans, I think with enough time, if you can, we're not going to evolve laser eyes, like you said, but we can look to other species to see what might be possible. Because, if you look at all other mammals, we all descended from the same common ancestor. And so really anything that we see coming up in some of those mammals could potentially, given enough time, come up in humans. And so, yeah, it's kind of a fun, imaginative process to think about what we could evolve to. And I think the most important thing to consider when thinking about how we could evolve is that the way evolution works is the trait has to be heritable. So it has to be something that can somehow be encoded in your DNA. It has to change how you survive. So either, your likelihood of surviving long enough to produce offspring, or your offspring's, their likelihood of surviving, like how many offspring you're going to produce. So anything that changes your survivability in that way, and that's heritable, encoded in your genetics, that's something that could evolve. So this is interesting in terms of thinking about like old age. I brought it up because, we couldn't necessarily evolve to live 200 years unless that's just kind of a byproduct of something that's happening earlier. Because anything that happens after you've finished your reproductive years isn't going to have an effect on the number of children that you have or how those children survive.
And does culture also have an effect on that? For example, in the Western culture, we're moving towards having less children. So does that have an effect then on those genetics as well, I assume?
So yeah, this idea of us having fewer children, or certain of us having fewer children, is actually in there's a film that is the most accurate portrait of evolution that I've ever seen. And it's this movie called Idiocracy. I don't know if you've seen it. But essentially it starts with the premise that, the only part of this that's not accurate is that intelligence is heritable. We've yet to find a heritable really component to intelligence. But anyway, it starts with the idea that like stupid people in the US are having more children than intelligent people. And so then it suggests that after many, many generations, the population becomes less intelligent. And so it imagines this future in which everybody's intelligence is lowered quite dramatically because of this form of evolution. And, if it were true that intelligence were heritable, and less intelligent people were having more children than more intelligent people, then that would be true. In the future, we would expect, this is classic natural selection, where you have something that's driving a change in reproductive success. So it is interesting to think about who's having children and what the features of the people who are having more children versus people who are having less children are. And, not to say that, how that's going to affect future generations, but it is going to change the distribution of genetic variation in the future.
And also in terms of genetic adaptations, a lot of people are trying to get humanity into space and maybe even to Mars. One of the major problems that they're having is, for example, space radiation. Is that something that we could evolve to cope with?
Yeah, definitely. So there are actually microbes that are very good at handling radiation. And so, a lot of the negative effects of radiation are to do with, they damage our DNA, and we have innate mechanisms to correct DNA damage, but those just can't keep up with the rate that the damage is happening. And so if we were able to evolve, faster DNA repair, then maybe that's something that we could evolve that would make us better at going into space. But of course, it would need to happen over many generations, because you'd need to have the people who are carrying that ability to have more children, and for them to have more children, and so on and so on.
So basically speaking, it's possible, but if you want to, for example, escape climate change by going to space, we don't have enough time to adapt, so then it's not functional.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you'd be better off relying on technological solutions in that
Yeah,
case. I mean, my preference would be that we fix the Earth and don't
I
have to
agree.
escape, but yeah.
Melissa, before we close, do you have a take-home message for our listeners?
Yeah, I just think that it's really important to stay curious and to, ask questions and be persistent in your pursuit of those answers, and really just appreciate how incredible this world is that we live in, and all of the changes in everything around us, caused by evolution, caused by other factors, and in our own bodies.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
This was Apple Finch Pudding. I want to thank Melissa Ilardo for the information. Let's meet again for the next episode of Apple Finch Pudding.